Five, four, three, two, one. Coming to you live as Lichtman Live. Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, Democratic convention, the last convention of this political season, the big chance for Kamala Harris to introduce herself to the American people. There's been an extraordinary transformation, which we'll talk about in a little while when we get to talking about the convention. But I know Sam wants to give some shout outs.
Yes, let's see who's in the chat. Member Barry Smith, President Belichick, Sherry Water, Member Secretary of State Andrew, Jake Albright, Orange Whip, Mike DeNicola, Izzy, Barry Smith, Kyle Fishman. So many great people. Jeff Casey, Will Strumicher, Mr. Carrot, William Dang, Cameron Kerr, Miles Wolf, Early Riser, Sebastian, Terry. Gosh, so many great people in the chat. But let's start out, Dad, with our own breaking news that your prediction is going to be a little bit delayed than what we
Just
originally.
a little bit delayed. You know, Delayed gratification can be a good thing, even in this era of everybody wanting instant gratification. We'll continue to talk about the keys uniquely here on the show. I'm not giving interviews on my predictions anywhere but on our own live show. So take care. And the problem is, the period after the convention between the end of August, that week or so, and Labor Day is the most dead time of the year when people are on vacation, not paying attention. That flips right after Labor Day. And that's why we've decided to make the prediction right after Labor Day rather than to throw it into that dead time between the end of August and Labor Day. So
There you go. Pretty
it's not
simple.
substantive in the sense that I necessarily have to wait that extra week, but it is geared to giving the maximum impact. And remember, as soon as it's released, we're going to have a live show that very day, and you'll be the first show to hear about it.
Right. So it's not super complicated, it's just the issue of timing, essentially.
No, it's nothing complicated, nothing sinister, nothing special about it. So, the Democratic convention.
Yeah, what's your reaction so far? We had day one. We had a bunch of really big speakers: Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton. Yeah, what's your reaction?
Well, first of all, my biggest reaction is, my goodness, how the Democratic Party in just a month has transformed itself. I never thought that would happen. I can't call the Democrats spineless anymore. Or can I call them, fractured and divided? Will Rogers, way back in the 20s, the great humorist, said, I belong to no organized political party. I am a Democrat. And that's been characteristic of the Democrats over the next century. They've been a fractured party. They've been a party that plays wiffle ball while the Republicans play hardball. They've played kind of not to lose. They've been timid. And all that has suddenly changed. Probably because they listened to the show and they listened to the advice that we've been putting out. But just think about it. A month ago, Kamala Harris was either an irrelevant or reviled figure. Her approval rating was in the 30% range. When she tried to run in the Democratic primary for the presidential nomination, she crashed and burned. Few people had good things to say about her. The Democratic Party was splitting itself into pieces, going into a panic over what happened with Biden's faltering performance in the first debate, openly trashing. We've never seen anything like it. Their sitting president and the nominee of the voters within their party. And yet, just in a matter of a few weeks, that has been transformed. We can take a little bit of credit for that, right, Sam? Because we've been
Yeah.
stressing the Democrats cannot afford to lose the contest key.
Oh, true,
If they lost both the incumbency key and the contest key, that was almost a sure path to defeat. Whereas if they lost the incumbency but preserve the contest key, they'd only lose one key and still have a good path to victory. And I gave some examples of open seats without a contest where the party holding the White House has won. Herbert Hoover, the 1928 Republican candidate, or George H.W. Bush, the 1988 Republican candidate. All of a sudden, the Democrats have united virtually unanimously. If you listen to the roll call at all, there was a handful of people who voted present, well under, probably 1/10 of 1%. The rest of the party has united and enthusiastically united about Kamala Harris, a complete turnaround of where she stood just a month ago. And the same thing we've seen in approval polls. Her approval over the last month, once the Democrats united behind her, has shot up by about 10 points.
How do you
She's,
explain all this? I don't get it either. How do you I don't
yeah,
understand it.
it's, well, I think Democrats are listening to us. We know we're in close touch with Ron Klain, maybe Biden's closest advisor. And I think they're finally getting the message that they can't win by playing not to lose, that they can't win by having big party brawls and showing all their divisions out in public like they were doing just a month or 6 weeks ago. Somehow the message has gotten through that the only way they're going to win is by uniting and by uniting behind a single candidate, not having a brawl. The other thing I think that's uh, really galvanized the Democrats is Trump. Democrats are just absolutely apocalyptic about the idea of another Trump presidency. I think Democrats really believe that it portends the end of American democracy and certainly the end of anything Democrats believe in, whether union rights or reproductive rights or climate change or progressive taxation, all gone. So I think, you know, I'll give you a historical analogy. In 1948, Harry Truman wanted to enact his Truman Doctrine for an aggressive anti-communist American policy. But there was a huge isolationist wing within the Republican Party, and he wanted to bring the Republicans along. So he went to Arthur Vandenberg, the leader of Republican Party when it came to foreign policy. And he said, Arthur, what can I do to bring Republicans along? And he said, there's only one thing, scare them to death. And I think that's what Donald Trump has done to unite Democrats. He's scared them to death. Politics, it's like Wall Street. It operates on two principles, greed and fear. And I think, a lot of fear has motivated the Democrats. I thought it was a very good night for Democrats last night, except for the mismanagement of pushing Biden's 30 Eastern, past prime time on Eastern, uh, close to being past prime time on Central, 10:30. And let's face it, almost all the swing states are on Eastern time or Central time, right, Sam? Pennsylvania, Georgia, possibly Florida could be in play, uh, Wisconsin, Michigan. Uh, most of the critical swing states are Central or Eastern, and they just pushed him too late. Too many speakers who went on too long. I thought the speeches were bad. I thought a lot of them were really good. I thought Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was outstanding.
Yeah.
She could be the Barack Obama of 2024.
Yeah, I agree.
Those of us who are old enough remember Barack Obama's 2004 convention speech that catapulted him from an unknown state politician in Illinois to 4 years later, the Democratic presidential nominee and president-elect of the United States. I'm not saying AOC's rise will be that meteoric, but she was very, very good, as was the UAW head, Mr. Swain. He probably had the best line of the night. Remember that one, Sam? About
Trump's
unions?
Trump's a scab. Trump's scab. That one?
Right. The worst thing a union member could possibly say about anyone. You're a union buster. You want to fire strikers. I can't believe uh, Trump said that. Oh, I just got a message from your amazing mom saying Kamala Harris is officially confirmed by the roll call vote, a ceremonial roll call vote, as the Democratic presidential nominee. And if you watch the roll call, I always like to watch at least kind of great local color. The enthusiasm for her was just amazing. This kind of incredible new trajectory of the Democratic Party. Uh, I thought, despite the late hour, Joe Biden's speech was extraordinary. If he had spoken like that at the first debate, he'd still be the Democratic Party nominee. He was forceful. He was on point. He was inspirational. He managed simultaneously to do something Democrats haven't really done, bring home the accomplishments of the Biden administration, which have been virtually unknown to the American people, while explaining why he was passing the torch to a younger nominee. I thought, while Swain had the best slogan, I thought Biden had the best line. I was both too young to be a U.S. senator and too old to continue as president. That's not exactly what he said, but it's pretty close. It was a very good line. He went on for a long time, maintained his energy, didn't, blip out. It was, quite an extraordinary speech. And a lot of the speeches, I've highlighted some, were very, very good. And you could see the Democrats also got strategic finally, understanding the issues that worked for them. Perhaps the most moving moments of the convention were those people, the women who were denied needed medical care because of these draconian anti-abortion laws in some of the red states. That was incredibly moving. Or the woman, who said, I was raped and pregnant at 12. Should 12-year-olds be able to be forced to carry the offspring of their rapists? Very, very powerful moments. And Democrats fully understand that reproductive rights is a big issue and a very important issue for them. And it's going to be on the ballot in a number of states, right? You want me to hurry up here?
You're not supposed to
I
give
think I'm
away.
saying important
You're
things.
not supposed to give away my secret hand signals. Nobody can see them
Yeah.
except for you.
Florida, Arizona, and it's right here, as your wonderful mom and my wife reminds me, who, by the way, was the leader to codify Roe v. Wade on the statute books in Maryland over 30 years ago. Now there is a referendum to put Roe v. Wade, the protections of reproductive rights, in the state constitution. It's item one, referendum one, and a yes vote would establish constitutionally reproductive freedom in Maryland. Last point I want to make.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you quickly before you move on. Everybody is clamoring and they want to know your take on the social unrest at the convention and its impact on the social unrest
A big
key.
fizzle. There aren't tens of thousands of people engaging in mass protests that lead to violence, clashes with police. We've seen small protests, for the most part peaceful, just about a dozen arrests, and it's localized. Remember, this is a very high threshold key. To turn this key, there has to be massive nationwide unrest sufficient to call into question the stability of society, like we saw in the late 1960s and early 1970s when the cities were in flame, when millions of people were out protesting, when there were assassinations, students killed at Kent State and Jackson State. It doesn't even rise to the level of the millions who are out for the Black Lives Matter movement protests and, the violence and disorder and the inappropriate Trump response to that. Not even close. We're nowhere near. I'm still keeping an open mind. There's still time to go in the convention. But so far, I've seen nothing to turn the social unrest key, but I haven't made my final word yet.
Thank you for that, sir. And yeah, it's certainly not. I mean, people forget that too. That the 1968 DNC was one of many things that was happening across the country, right?
Exactly. It was not
And
an
this
isolated.
alone isn't anywhere, even in the universe of even just the DNC that year, right?
We're nowhere near in the universe. You're right. Even what happened at the DNC, much less millions of people out in the street, violence, assassinations, urban riots, were nothing like the 60s or early 70s.
Right. Um, and
Last point
what
before we get to the questions. RFK
well,
Jr.
I was gonna set you up for that because
Oh,
we actually have a specific question from Jared Klein who donated $50. They said, "Do you think RFK Jr. would drop out of this election and endorse Trump?"
the answer is I don't know. The guy is so off kilter that he's really unpredictable. Uh, I have seen reports, mostly from his vice presidential pick, someone never heard of, but a woman who has a lot of money apparently, that they are seriously considering dropping out and endorsing Trump. But I've not seen final confirmation of that. It wouldn't shock me because his campaign is fading. You've already heard me say, well, I haven't called that key. It certainly doesn't look like RFK is going to rebound, RFK Jr. It's possible. I'm still looking at it, but I think they're looking in the mirror and realizing we're not likely to be going anywhere, even as a spoiler. But I'm still reserving judgment.
But interestingly, according to the keys, if he does do that, if he drops out and joins Trump, it actually helps Harris because it doesn't turn the third party key.
Absolutely correct. And, you know, his endorsement of Trump has nothing to do with the keys, doesn't turn a key one way or the other. And aside from the keys, who knows what that would mean to people out there. It might motivate them to vote for Trump. It might turn them off. Here's this guy who claims to be independent, not, tied to the party system. Now he's telling us we got to vote for one of the two-party candidates, that he's denounced. Come on, we're going to do the opposite. So, just intuitively leaving aside the keys, it doesn't necessarily help Trump at all.
Right. All right. Anything else to add before we get to the questions?
I think we're ready for the questions. What do you think, Sam?
I think so as well, sir.
The only thing I would add is I like your haircut.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Um, Miguel Diaz asks, if Kamala Harris is elected, is she able to use her official powers to change the Roe versus Wade decision?
To change what? The
Roe,
Roe versus Wade decision?
yes.
No, it's a Supreme Court decision. She can't reinstate Roe versus Wade, but they can try to bolster abortion rights through executive orders. Very, very difficult, but this is a moonshot because it would take 60 votes in the Senate, and in the most optimistic predictions, Democrats won't come close to that after this election. You could establish abortion rights in effect by statute, because all that the Supreme Court, not all, but what the Supreme Court decision did was overturn a previous Supreme Court decision. Doesn't preclude, as we saw, state legislation, and it doesn't preclude federal legislation.
Vacuum tubes for hi-fi. Thank you for your donation. They say, hi, Professor. What is your opinion of the Air Force General Curtis Emerson LeMay, old Iron Pants? What does it say about his character that he was George Wallace's running mate in 1968?
Yeah, George Wallace was a third party candidate who got a lot of votes. He got about 13% of the votes. Back in 1968, there was still a lot of segregationist sentiment, a lot of racism. Unfortunately, racism has not been eradicated. And he made a terrible choice with General LeMay. He was the guy who said, and I'm paraphrasing, it was a long time ago, we want to bomb North Vietnam into the Stone Age. It was, bomb them to death. LeMay, who, had no real political experience, political positions. Wallace picked him because it fit Wallace's tough guy, you know, persona. If they riot here in Alabama, they're going to taste a bullet. We're going to be for law and order. We're not going to tolerate all these demonstrations, these hippies, and picking LeMay just, I assume, was designed to reinforce his tough guy image.
Right. Dudley Murdoch says, after you make your final prediction, will you be creating a writing? Will you be creating and writing a PDF social education of your final prediction of who is favored to win?
I've been asked to do that, but I will have articles coming out with my final prediction.
Member Nazar72 says, who was the worst president of the past 100 years? Expecting Trump or Hoover, but the vast majority say Reagan. Are you surprised?
The vast majority of who say Reagan.
I don't know.
I'm not sure what the questioner is referring to, but there have been a number of polls. By no means does Reagan come out at the bottom. Donald Trump comes out at the bottom, and I agree with that. Never had a president before who sought to undermine American democracy, who incited a violent coup. That certainly, plummets him in the rankings of presidents, and authorities, political scientists, historians have ranked him last among presidents of the last 100 years.
And he,
Not Reagan at
even
all.
even if you think about policy, he wasn't very effective, especially given the fact that he had a totally red Congress for a long
Yeah, the big
time.
thing he got was this big tax cut that mostly benefited corporations and the more affluent, and that blew a huge hole in the deficit. Remember, he promised to repeal and replace Obamacare. Never happened. Promised infrastructure day, where we'd have a big infrastructure bill. Never happened. You know, this may not be something for Congress, but the promise was we're going to build a wall totally around the southern border, and who's going to pay for it, Sam?
Mexico.
Did that happen?
No, senor.
And he shattered, collective security. NATO was in tatters at the end of the Trump administration. He also was terrible on climate change, withdrawing us from the Paris Accords, gutting the EPA, issuing executive orders designed to limit our ability to combat catastrophic climate change, promoting drilling and the burning and mining and the burning of fossil fuels. So there's a whole host of reasons, and I haven't gone through them all, why authorities have ranked Donald Trump at the bottom.
Yeah, and not to mention that he
And
had.
let's not forget his disastrous response to the
I was
COVID-19.
about to say that. I was about to say that.
Oh, no.
Member Barry Smith says, can Biden still resign and give Harris the incumbency key, or is that option completely moot?
I'd say not in a technical sense, but in a practical sense, it is muted. A, it's not going to happen unless, heaven forbid, catastrophic health issue. And B, it would look bad at this point. I think they understand that.
Right. Shay Hendricks says, based on the progress in Ukraine, what direction is the foreign/military success key leaning as of now? Leaning true, leaning false, or undecided?
I'd say, it's undecided. Some events recently have moved it a little bit more towards the incumbent party, although not enough to say it leans or likely. But we've had a couple of big developments. One is the prisoner swap, which does at least make big news briefly. It seems to have been forgotten, but it was a very extraordinary accomplishment. And two, the Ukrainian incursion into Russia, which has the potential to be a big game changer in the war. I'm monitoring that very carefully uh, because that definitely could affect the foreign policy keys. As I've said before, we don't have boots on the ground there, but we are deeply committed. American prestige, American money, American arms are deeply committed to Ukraine in that war. And I guess they're still trying to pursue a ceasefire and hostage release in the Middle East, but who knows whether that's going to come about or not. But that could be a game changer as well if that happened.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, G1, for your donation. Arash Taheri says, Dr. Lichtman, could you explain the magic of how Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan were able to sweep all but one state in 1972 and 1984?
Let me start with 1984, because that was the first election I predicted. I predicted Ronald Reagan's reelection in April 1982, almost 3 years ahead of time, when the nation was in the midst of its worst recession to date since the Great Depression, when 60% said he was too old to run again, when his approval ratings were low. And I saw only three keys, which portended while the keys do not directly predict the popular vote margins, there is a correlation, and that did portend a pretty good uh, victory for Reagan. And of course, by the time 1984 rolled around, uh, the economy was engaged in one of its greatest booms. Reagan had emerged as one of the great communicators as a president. Democrats did not have a charismatic challenger to put up against him. The country was tranquil, and Reagan made a big decision. There was a big debate inside the Reagan administration of how he should run in 84. The pragmatists, led by Lee Atwater, with whom I consulted in 1982, the political director, wanted to run a strictly pragmatic campaign. The ideologues, led by Ed Meese, the Attorney General, wanted to run an ideological campaign. The pragmatists won. We had the Morning in America, kind of a very bland but broadly appealing kind of campaign with the great communicator. 1972, Richard Nixon totally transformed his presidency with one goal in mind. That's all he cared about: re-election. So he goes off the gold standard. He pumps up the economy. And then to keep the economy roaring but not inflated, he does something amazing for a Republican. He institutes wage and price controls. And his advisors say, boy, in the long run, that's not going to work. And he said, I don't care about the long run. I only care about 1972. Then he totally reorders international relations, huge new treaties with Soviet Russia. And what country does he open up really for the first time since the 1940s? His
China.
great trip to
China.
China.
Got it
So,
right.
yes, you got it. Does all these amazing things to assure himself of a big reelection. And of course, the Democrats nominated my good friend George McGovern, a very honest guy, but not a John F. Kennedy or an FDR.
Right. Member Megan Frankie says, philosopher Plato once maintained that in democracies, people tend to vote for demagogues, but your keys suggest they vote for governance. Was Plato wrong about democracies?
And they vote for governance where you need to speak a little louder. I'm not hearing you.
I was speaking the same level I always speak.
I know for some reason you're not coming through, but I just missed one word there.
What was the word you missed?
In a democracy, they vote for demagogues, and in a
Let's see here. One second. Is this better? Can you hear me better now?
yes,
Okay. Um, Philosopher Plato once maintained that in democracies, people vote for demagogues, but your keys suggest they vote for governance. Was Plato wrong about democracies?
well, in Plato's time, democracy was not what it is today. It was more of a direct democracy where you had meetings and people governing more directly. Today, it's a democratic republic when people vote for their representatives. I have great respect for uh, Plato, but I think things have changed since his time. And I stand by the fact that it is governance, not campaigning, that counts. Sam, before you get to the next question, can you remind people about all the things, donations, memberships, all these other things you talk about?
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because we don't get donations and members, we're going dark.
Everybody knows. We talk about that every time. We don't need to talk about it. Um, Member Ben 17620.
All right, I have another question then.
Okay.
How many viewers?
3,000.
Nice.
Yes. Um, Member Ben 17624 says, if RFK Jr. fails to turn the major third party candidate key false, could him dropping out hurt Harris? Which is a strange question, right? Because we just said the opposite. It would
The
help her.
opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah, it vitiates the key that could turn against her if he drops out. And as I said, leaving aside the keys, just intuitively, it's not at all clear that it would help Trump because there could be a big backlash against him trying to coerce voters to vote for Trump when he's campaigned on the fact that both parties are corrupt. We can't support anyone who's a Democrat or a Republican. It would be your beautiful mom says you do need to talk about donations and memberships, etc. So go ahead.
Um, okay, fine. We talk about it every week.
That's okay. We have different viewers every week.
Just to, if people don't know, members and donations get priority of their questions asked. Doesn't guarantee your question is going to get asked, but it gives you priority. If you want to become a member, you click the join button. We post a community tab before the show where members can post their questions. Subscribe, like this stream. If you like this stream, it helps the algorithm push us, et cetera, et cetera. Member Patrick Murray says, why do dictators even exist? Hey, focus, Dad. Focus.
I'm checking. Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
I
I'm focused.
understand.
Why do dictators even exist?
Yeah.
Because of human nature. You know, there's always warring impulses inside of us. On the one hand, we love our freedom, our opportunities to choose. We don't want to be controlled by others. But there's a warring impulse. There's an opposite impulse, which is very, very strong. And that is we like order. We like control. We like discipline. We think that's good for us and good for our society. And that's what dictators exploit, that other impulse within us that craves for order and discipline, that craves for clear, black and white, not distinctions of gray that occur when there's freedom and democracy. Plus, what dictators exploit, every dictator, is racial divisions, religious divisions, ethnic divisions. And, as old as time, those divisions, you read the Bible, those divisions have been present in human societies, misogyny as well. All of those elements are exploited by those who would be dictators, as well as exploiting the big lie. Tell a lie loudly and often enough, and people will come to believe it. Those are the classic hallmarks of how dictators come into power.
Right.
Briefly put, there have been whole libraries written on this.
Right. I'm not sure if I understand this question, but I'll throw it to you and we'll see what happens. Jim Blower says, just after the debate, if Biden stays in the race, he will lose. The key suggests the Democrats will win. Conclusion, Biden will quit the race. This actually happened, but is this valid reasoning?
Who knows? We'll never know what would have happened if Biden stayed in the race, right? You can speculate all you want, and it means nothing. That's an unanswerable question. Just like what would have happened if Lyndon Johnson stayed in the race or Harry Truman. We'll never, ever know. But the one thing, and I'll keep stressing this, that I warn the Democrats they had to avoid, and they did avoid was both to have an open seat and a big brawl for the party nomination.
Yep. DeBomb360 says, do you think Tim Walz could emerge as a charismatic candidate if he ran in 32? He'd be an old dude by then.
So you're asking me to speculate 8 years from now?
Yes.
You know what? You can answer that question any way you want because there's no real answer.
What do you mean? There's
Who
no, who
knows
the hell
what's
knows?
going to be going on 8 years from now?
Right. This is a question from our Discord. If you want to join our Discord or our Reddit, the links to those are both in the description of this video. You can also follow me at Sammy Licht on Instagram and YouTube. You can follow this man at Alan Lichtman on X, Instagram, and TikTok. The Discord question is, what are the chances? So we posted this this Gore versus Bush video the other day. So their question is in relation to that. What are the chances of a Bush versus Gore SCOTUS intervention in this election?
Not impossible. You know, if you had asked me a few years ago, I would have said certainly not, because in 2020 and its aftermath, the Supreme Court had scrupulously avoided getting involved in post-election disputes. But since then, we've seen a much more aggressive Supreme Court that's gutted federal regulatory agencies, overturned Roe v. Wade, refused to apply Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to Donald Trump, giving President broad immunities for official acts broadly defined. So we have a much more aggressive Supreme Court, it seems, than we had a few years ago. And while I still think it's unlikely we'll see another Bush v. Gore, I wouldn't rule it out.
Right. What are your thoughts on former Chief Justice William Rehnquist, and is it true that he was in favor of segregation?
Hard to say. Probably, way back when. But, I'm not going to, I can't definitively answer that because I haven't researched it myself. What I can tell you that's true and very controversial about Rehnquist, back before he was a justice, he was one of the forces behind so-called Operation Eagle Eye by Republicans in 1964, way back then, which was designed to suppress the minority vote by putting up threatening signs about voting in minority communities, like you could be arrested, for traffic violations and, other things that may be on your record. And Republicans continued those efforts until there was a consent agreement, an injunction, a couple of them in the 1980s that weren't repealed until I think about either 2017, 2019, somewhere right around there. They held, for a very long period of time, over 20 years. And we see again new efforts to suppress the minority vote. And if you watch the convention, you've heard some of the discussion of that from minority Democrats in red states.
Member Abject Ladder says, is a Gaza ceasefire the only thing that would prevent the no military or foreign failure key turning definitively false?
I can't say that. I mean, again, you're asking me to answer a hypothetical, which I can't do, but I would say that's certainly for the Democrats, the most positive event on the horizon. But as I pointed out before, we did have a major change in the Ukraine war with the incursion into Russia. And I'm waiting to see if that's going to be a game changer, which it could.
Right. Deborah Roach says, Dr. Lichtman, Donald Trump is proposing a mass deportation of, quote, criminal and undocumented immigrants. Do you think that or even the threat of it, would have an extremely negative effect on food prices and our economy as a whole.
It would be a disaster for our country. Every independent economist agrees with that. Not only that, can you imagine? The Republican Party claims to be the party of limited government, freedom. Can you imagine the government intrusion that would be needed to deport, 10 to 12 million so-called undocumented immigrants? It's not as if we have these communities with big signs around them. This is an undocumented community of undocumented, this is a community of undocumented immigrants. They are mixed in with the population. They're married to US citizens. Their children are US citizens. Their relatives, their neighbors are US citizens. So if you think this would just affect the undocumented immigrants, which is bad enough, you're dreaming. It would have an enormous ripple effect on our entire society. It would virtually take a police state to pull this off. On top of that, if you succeed, you might as well shut down the agricultural industry, the hospitality industry, the construction industry, and the domestic service industry with crippling effects on the economy. Hey, who did Donald Trump hire to clear the land for Trump Tower and make his beds and clean his house on Mar-a-Lago, Sam?
Undocumented folks.
Undocumented immigrants, because he'd have to pay them, or pay them little, much less than other workers. So it would really be an enormous imposition on the lives of tens of millions of Americans, as well as cripple our economy. It's one of the worst proposals to come down from either party in many, many decades.
Right. Our Discord folks want to know, can you debunk / live react to Red Eagle's politics critique of the 13 keys?
Whose critique?
Red Eagle Politics.
I have no idea what their critique is.
Okay.
There have been lots of critiques. I don't pay attention to every single one of them, but I'll answer the question if someone could be a little more specific about what the critique is. I don't even know who
I think
they are.
they want you to watch it and then critique it.
Is it worth my while to watch it, Sam?
I'll watch it first and I'll let you know. How about that?
All right.
All right.
And, if it's, substantial critique, I will respond to it next time. But over 40 years, I've heard it all. I've heard every single possible critique of the keys, I think, and I've answered all of them. So, and the record speaks for itself. No other system comes close to a 40-year record of success.
There you go. Mark McNeil wants to know, what are the Dems' prospects for holding the Senate?
I think pretty good, but it might depend on the presidency. Right now, I think the best hope for the Democrats is to lose one seat. That is to lose West Virginia, where Joe Manchin isn't running again, and then hold all their incumbencies. Looks like Sherrod Brown, Ohio, is probably going to win, and John Tester in the red state of Montana seems to be doing extremely well. Now, for you Democrats out there, if you want to be wildly optimistic, you might say, well, maybe we could defeat Senator Cruz in Texas, and maybe we could turn the Florida Senate seat around and maybe even get an extra one seat. I think that's a little bit optimistic, but I think if the Democrats are going to hold, it's 50 seats, which would then depend upon the Democrats winning the presidency, because then Vice President Walz would be casting the tying vote. But it's going to be a nail biter and very, very close, because Democrats are defending red state seats. Republicans are not defending any blue state seats.
Right. Alex Kawa says, how worried are you that SCOTUS could disenfranchise thousands of Arizona voters? There's a new case, right, with Arizona voters?
Yeah, I'm not. There are a whole bunch of cases in Arizona. I'm not sure there's a U.S. Supreme Court case pending in Arizona. So if we could get a little more specific, but I'm not aware that the Supreme Court is considering an Arizona case. I know there's a lot of controversy about how to count votes in Arizona, but I don't think it's reached the Supreme Court. But I could be wrong.
Gotcha. Casey Adams says, from a historical perspective, why do some presidents succeed at foreign policy and others fail? Is it luck or skill?
There have been libraries written on that. In part, it's certainly luck. You know, maybe our luckiest president was Ronald Reagan, who had a disastrous second term. You know, no big policy changes after Reaganomics, uh, a budding scandal in the Iran Contra scandal. But then he gets saved by a monumental change in the Soviet Union with the advent of the reformist Mikhail Gorbachev, who works with Reagan to achieve a very important treaty on intermediate nuclear forces in Europe, these short-range missiles that can reach their target in a few minutes, and really brings America to the brink of victory in war. Now, some may say, you know, it was also due to some skill on the part of Ronald Reagan because of his staunch anti-Soviet stance and his willingness to try to undermine the communist regime in Russia and its empire. So it's kind of a combination of the two. In Franklin Roosevelt's case, you know, who led us through the world's most gruesome war, was mostly skill. He had to combat a bitterly powerful isolationist movement at home just to get the Lend-Lease through, which stopped Hitler from conquering Russia and Great Britain, and then to lead America successfully through World War II. So I also think on the other side, you know, presidents have made some grave mistakes. Most notable in recent history, the Vietnam War and the war in Iraq, one by a Democratic president, Johnson, the other by a Republican president, W. Bush.
There you go. That person asks, as a historian and analyst, how do you get your news? And how would you advise the average person to consume news?
I get my news through news feeds, actually. Believe it or not, I've gotten into the digital age. You know, when I was growing up, we wrote our papers on, you know, tablets with chisels. But
Right.
now I'm into the digital age and I get a whole series of news feeds. And I think that is, and you can, you know, go left, right, middle, everything is available. I think that is the most efficient way of getting news these days.
You use Google News to be specific, right?
I use Google News, but I have the Daily Signal on the right. I have the New Republic. I have the Washington Post. I have the New York Times. I have AP. I have CNN. I have
Right.
a lot.
Right. Our good friend Dr. Ash says, is it easier for men to satisfy the charisma key than women? Could the charisma key have been true for AOC last night?
Well, that's an impossible question to ask because there's only been one woman candidate before Kamala Harris, which she's so new in the history of the country. I certainly think AOC did herself a lot of good, but you can't judge a candidate as one of these once in a generation inspirational candidates on the basis of a single speech. But we'll see if that's like the Barack Obama 2004 convention speech.
Right. It was pretty good, I have to say.
It was very good.
Member Nicholas James says, excuse me, could Project 2025 be considered a potential cause for putting down one of the keys? Do you understand that question?
I don't see where it affects a key. The only key it could conceivably affect, since it's a element of the challenging party, would be the challenger charisma key, but I already rated that key true. I did not rate Trump as a once in a generation, broadly inspirational candidate.
Member Turbid TG1 says, why weren't there any debates between LBJ and Goldwater back in 64?
Well, LBJ had no incentive to debate Goldwater. He was, 30 some odd points ahead. They were portraying Goldwater as this dangerous radical who would throw grandma under the bus by destroying Social Security, who was itching to mash the nuclear button. They launched the most controversial commercial, the Democrats in 64, in the history of presidential elections, the so-called Daisy commercial. Are you familiar with that, Sam?
I'm not sure. It sounds familiar.
Little blonde girl, maybe 10 years old, plucking petals off a daisy and kind of counting down from 10, but sort of adding to the charm of it. She didn't quite get it right. She'd say 10, 9, 7, 8. And then when she gets down to 0, she's obliterated in this huge nuclear explosion with a big mushroom cloud, and Johnson comes on. That is the choice. Do we move ahead or do we go back into the darkness?
Right. Yes, I do know that
Certainly
commercial.
even worse than the Willie Horton commercial that's so notorious from 1988.
Um, Miles Wolf says, do you think that if climate change continues to limit natural resources, that Americans will be less supportive of welfare programs, more focused on their own well-being, and thus, in a way, more conservative?
I'm not sure they'd become more conservative because that could go either way, but I do think, the more the country becomes inhospitable, obviously there's going to be some turning inward, but will there be a realization you can't solve climate change in one country? It's a global issue. Emissions are emissions no matter where they come from. And the United States may be in the lead, but there are so many other countries very much contributing to climate change. That's why you had an effort to bring countries together, as minimal as it was, in the Paris Accords.
Diesel Seattle, thank you for your donation. They say, again, thank you for all you do. Obviously, we are all worried about razor thin margins in swing states, leading to a SCOTUS intervention like 2000, a likely setup. Do you anticipate late a possible civil war if they try?
No, I
No,
think
no civil wars.
warnings of civil war are way overblown on both sides. Even with Bush v. Gore, which ignited, a firestorm of protests and reaction. We weren't remotely close to a civil war. But I think it would be an incredibly dangerous situation if the Supreme Court jumped in effect, overturned the verdict of the people. Maybe not civil war, but in many ways, a destabilization of our society and a delegitimization of the rule of law. I don't think it's going to happen, as I said earlier, but I wouldn't 100% rule it out.
Right. Our chat mod, Sean, asks, it looks like we may be on the precipice of a ceasefire and hostage release in the Middle East. Would you say it's likely at this point?
Look, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I don't have any information on the inside. So I have the same news sources that you do. And the last I saw, it is more likely than before, but I wouldn't necessarily bet my fortune if I had one on it.
Right. Alexander Garrison says, do you think the GOP will try to impeach Biden after the GOP committee report? If they are successful, will this have an effect on the scandal key?
I don't think they're going to try to impeach Biden. It would look so blatantly political that I don't think it would help them. Plus, they have a razor thin margin in the House. They're not going to get any Democrats to support an impeachment. So, I don't believe that they have every single Republican in line to do this. Again, you know, what did Benjamin Disraeli, the great British Prime Minister, say, Sam? Finality is not a word we use in politics. So I'm not saying it absolutely cannot happen. I think it is wildly unlikely, nor would it turn the scandal key. Because what would be missing, Sam, that's required in the scandal?
Bipartisan recognition and support.
Exactly. It has to be at least some bipartisan recognition. Even with all the Trump stuff, remember, there were a lot of Republicans who weren't necessarily ready to impeach him, but who certainly thought a lot of what Trump did was wrong. And some of those Republicans are going to be speaking tonight at the Democratic convention.
Right. People are freaking out that there's protesters and police clashing in Chicago right now. But even that is not gonna turn the scandal key.
No, not localized.
2Z says, "Hi, Professor. Blah, blah, blah. Why can't I speak today? Hi, Professor. Will you agree with me that Kamala's new fame has something also to do with Biden being a transformative leader? Also, do you see Florida turning blue?"
Of course, it has something to do with, Biden's leadership. A lesser patriot would not have stepped down. Can you imagine Trump stepping down under similar circumstances? Would never have happened. You know, I've heard a lot of talk for a lot of years about Florida turning blue, Texas turning blue. It hasn't happened, but I'm not predicting it. I don't have a system for it, but there's probably more of a chance this year than before, given the national dynamics and given the presence of a reproductive freedom referendum on the ballot in Florida.
James Patrick Waddle, thank you for your donation, your question. We answered this last week. He doesn't care about odds makers and Trump's surging in poly market betting markets.
Not Trump is not surging. I checked, I'm just for curiosity, I checked all the markets. Every one of them has Harris ahead, at least as of late this afternoon.
Right, but regardless, it doesn't matter in your mind.
Regardless, it does not affect my predictions. Remember, I went against all the prediction markets in 2016.
All right, we're getting to the end of our show here, but remember, I go live in a post show right after this show because he's tired and needs to rest. But I'm ready to keep going. So the link to the post show is in the description of this video. It's on my channel. Give me a second to transition over. But there's 3,000 people watching that. I better see at least 50% of the people that are watching there, right?
Right. So are you implying you were young and sharp and I'm old and tired?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness.
Remember, Kyle Fishman says, "Why do you believe voters will reward major change in national policy in cases where the change is unpopular and goes against public opinion?"
I don't gauge public opinion. That's not the definition of the key. The definition of the key is policy change. And those public opinion polls are ephemeral. They can change overnight. And the point of the policy change key is it gives the party holding the White House something to run on. You can't run on nothing. You've got to run on some kind of policy accomplishments, whether or not the polls say it's popular or not. That's why I gave the Democrats in 2012 the policy change key based on the Affordable Care Act, despite fluctuating polls on its approval among the American people. And remember, those polls do not gauge voters. They gauge the general public, 40% of whom don't vote.
Right. Carlos Alvarez wants to know, will you consider making a video explaining why Donald Trump won 2016, but more importantly, why Hillary won? Lost, maybe they meant to say?
I don't anticipate making a video from what happened 8 years ago. There will be a video on my 2024 prediction.
Kevin W wants to know, what was in your mind the most memorable RNC and DNC?
Probably the most memorable RNC was 1976 when it came virtually to a tie at the convention between Ford and Reagan. Ford, of course, was the sitting appointed president, and by the narrowest of margins, in a very dramatic fashion, Ford ekes out the nomination, and then Reagan makes these incredible, you know, only Reagan can do it off the cuff remarks, which paved the way for his nomination and victory in 1980. Most memorable Democratic convention was surely 1960, the nomination of John F. Kennedy, made extraordinary acceptance address, and of course represented, as he put it, the passing of the torch to a new generation, which is what we're now seeing in 2024.
All right, you want to end it there, Dad? Or do you want to do some rapid fire?
Now let's take
You want to do some
maybe three rapid fires, although as a professor, I can't be that rapid.
All right, let's do some rapid fires. If new states are admitted into the Union, will the keys need to be reevaluated?
Absolutely not. Back to 1860 when there were only 30 some odd states in the Union.
Right, that's a good point. Dip Duck Dive says, do you see similarities between now and 1936 and 1940 when wars were coming back to Europe?
1936, no. To an extent, absolutely 1940, and I've talked about this before, when America was not directly involved in the foreign wars, but that the foreign wars deeply affected and implicated the national security of the United States. And you had a Democratic president, Franklin Roosevelt, committed to aiding the Allies resisting fascist aggression. And he had to fight very hard and won very narrowly against a bitter America First isolationist movement that did not want us to give a penny of aid to Britain or the Soviet Union. If they had their way, the Nazis would have conquered Russia, killed 3 or 4 million more Jews, likely conquered Britain, and then threatened the U.S. next.
Chris Wall says the Lend-Lease Act didn't come along until 1941, but the U.S. was assisting Britain in 1940, such as with the Destroyers for Bases deal. Since the war wasn't going well for the Allies at the time, did this make it a difficult decision for you to turn the foreign policy failure key true for 1940, or was it an easy decision since the U.S. wasn't as heavily... It's supposed to be rapid fire questions, right?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at 1940 since 1981 in over 40 years, so I don't recall. But the audience member,
no callers, not a single caller, not a single
no
caller.
calls. I know. The Destroyer for Bases deal was kind of a prelude to Lend-Lease. That is, we sent Britain 40 overage destroyers in return for basing rights on British possessions in the Caribbean. And unlike Lend-Lease, which was an act of Congress, my recollection is this was done by executive order.
Okay, we'll end it there. Most of the questions are repeats, but the common threads are nothing that's happened in Chicago so far is turning the social unrest key. The foreign / military keys are still up in the air. The third party key is still up in the air, although dropping.
But fading.
But fading, yes, because if RFK drops out, that would change things entirely. Most of the questions surround that in one way or another, so I think we're good for you to sign off, Dad. Do you have any final words for the people out there?
Yeah, the Democratic convention is still ongoing. I'm not sure when it's going to come on, but there's a major speech, of course, by former President Barack, one of the influential forces within the nation and the Democratic Party. And then, of course, kind of a unique presentation by Kamala Harris in that, she's just been the nominee for a few weeks. And this is her real chance to introduce herself to the American people and give us her vision for the next 4 years. That'll be Thursday.
Absolutely. If you want to keep watching the DNC with me on my channel, I'm doing the post show right now. Give me a few minutes to transition, but the link to that is in the description of the video. Say goodnight to the people, Dad.
Good night. We'll see you Thursday, the night of Harris's speech. Are we going to cover the speech live or it'll probably be too late?
We'll see.
We'll see. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.